Right. Okay, we are in the middle of Ayin Tes Amud Aleph 79a. We began yesterday with identifying what exactly is, or trying to identify what exactly is the size of this Keseves Hagasa, this large date that the Mishnah said is what one would need to eat to be culpable for having violated the prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur. As we mentioned, eating is prohibited no matter how much, whether that's biblical or rabbinic is a matter of discussion, as we discussed at the beginning of this chapter, way back when we started this chapter of Yoma. But the question is, how much does one need to eat in order to be culpable? That is, to be able to be liable for punishment. And that, the Mishnah says, Keseves Hagasa, the amount of a large date. The Gemara went into discussion without really resolving it yet. Is it with the pit, without the pit? What the Gemara is going to do now is, instead of answering the question directly about whether it has a pit or doesn't have a pit, the Gemara is going to frame the size, the Gemara is going to put this measurement in context of other measurements. And then by seeing and knowing what the size of other measurements is, and seeing the context in which this one relates to that, we'll know better what the size of this actual date is. So here we had the opinion which said that the Keseves Hagasa is a bit bigger than the Kibetza. We're going to see in the Gemara on the next page, that's actually a little less than the Kibetza, and that's the halacha. It's a little less than the Kibetza. So I think it's a little bit less than 1.5 ounces, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. What Hashem does, how he punishes, that's Hashem's business. Here we're talking about the court. When can the court administer lashes or require someone to bring a carbon? It's only if there were witnesses under a scenario where a person ate the amount of a Keseves Hagasa, of this large date. Yeah, right. So what Hashem does. We can't discuss that in terms of measurements. Well, sometimes we can, but that's not really how we usually have these discussions. Yeah. Yeah, so that's Hashem's own reckoning. Oh, in other words, it's possible that from Hashem's judgment or from Hashem's justice, a person might be held culpable even for less than this amount. If Hashem were to deem it that this person did it with such intention that he specifically wanted to violate Hashem's command, then maybe he would be liable in heaven also. But even if I said I want to defy Yom Kippur and ate less than this amount, the court could do nothing to me. Hashem might have a different story, right? So it's not exactly, they overlap, but not necessarily always match up exactly. So we're going to compare it to Kibetza momentarily. So right now we're under the assumption that the Keseves Hagasa, this large date, is bigger than a Kibetza. And that's what the Gemara is going to challenge. Basically, the Gemara challenges this very notion by bringing a source that's greater than the one speaking. The one speaking here is Rabbi Yehuda, who is the sage from the Gemara age, an Amoida, the Amoraic age. And we're now going to quote a Mishnaic age text, which reads, Maisa, the story is, they brought to Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai litam esatashal, to taste some sort of dish, and this was on Sukkah. And Rabbi Gamliel, who I suppose was present at the same time, they brought him shtei keseves, they brought him 2 dates, the dali shamayim, and a jug of water. So they brought Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai some dish, just a taste, not like a full meal. And Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, they brought him 2 dates and a glass of water. The Amru, and they said, Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai and Rabbi Gamliel, Helum l'Sukkah, take it up to the Sukkah. Sukkahs were usually on the deck, like on the top of the house, the roof. So they told him, bring it up to the Sukkah. Okay. But V'tanya Allah, we have learned about that story, not because one is required to eat in the Sukkah these items, but it's because they wanted to be strict upon themselves and didn't want to eat out of the sukkah. They were like Chabadniks. They didn't want to eat anything out of the sukkah, not even a date, not even a little taste of anything. So they told the people, bring it to the sukkah, even though, halachically speaking, they were not required to bring it up to the sukkah. This dish and the 2 dates/water. Okay? So we'll keep that in mind, but the Gemara is going to divert for a second. Now, but when they gave Rabbi Tzaddik some food that was less than a kabetza, so Rabbi Tzaddik was not so stringent upon himself. And he took 3 leniencies. Number 1, not labamapa. He took it with a cloth, va'achlo, and ate it. So the first leniency is that he didn't wash his hands, which is what we do when we eat wet food. Or actually, maybe, it was bread. Bread less than the size of a kabetza, less than the size of an egg. So number 1, didn't wash his hands. He took it with a cloth and ate it. Number 2, chutz l'sukkah. He did so outside of the sukkah. And number 3, he did not make an after blessing. Okay, so these are the 2 stories. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamliel being stringent in that they took even a little dish, and Rabbi Gamliel specifically, we're going to focus on Rabbi Gamliel specifically, who took 2 dates and a glass of water up to the sukkah, and he wasn't required to do it. This is the key here. He was not required to do it. He was not required to take those 2 dates and the water to the sukkah. He did it because he wanted to be machmir. Whereas Rabbi Tzaddik was not so stringent. Okay, so now what bearing does this have on our conversation? Says the Gemara, top of Ayin Testament Bay 79b. Hakabetza by sukkah. Now we know that once someone eats the size of an egg, hakabetza, he's required halachically to eat in the sukkah. But now the Isakah would suggest that that when the Mishnah said a large date, it means you say to kabetza a little bigger than a kabetza, a little bigger than the size of an egg. Then the 2 dates that Rabbi Gamliel ate, which were without their pits, presumably. Are you telling me that that's not the size of a kabetza? Not the size of a kabetza? And therefore, would that mean that the big date with its pit is more than a kabetza? What the Gemara is asking is like this. But let's do all the measures like in order. We have 3 measures here. We have the kabetza. Right? The kabetza is the cutoff line. Once you eat a kabetza, you have to eat in the sukkah. Okay. Now we have the big date, which we are assuming at the moment is bigger than the kabetza. But then we have 2 dates without a pit, 2 dates that Rabbi Gamliel ate, and he was not required to eat in the sukkah. So if Rabbi Gamliel had 2 dates that he wasn't required to eat in the sukkah, it means it must be lower than the kabetza, must be lower than the size of the egg. Otherwise, he would have had to eat in the sukkah, right? That would mean, logically then, that 2 dates without the pit is less than a kabetza, and 1 date with a pit is bigger than a kabetza. The Gemara is asking that, like, really? How big is this pit already? Following? How big is it that the pit takes a date, which if there were 2 of those would be less than a kabetza, and now turn one of those dates into bigger than a kabetza, bigger than the size of an egg. Clear on the question? Yeah? Sorry? Rabbi Gamliel ate 2 dates, and he didn't have to eat in the sukkah. Now that means it's less than the size of an egg, right? Now you, Rabbi Yehuda, assumed that a big date mentioned in our Mishnah, let's just assume it has its pit in it, right? Because it's a big date, so it has a pit, and that's the amount that one would need to eat to be liable for Yom Kippur. You, Rabbi Yehuda, suggest that is bigger than the size of an egg. So 2 dates, regular dates, are less than an egg, whereas 1 date with the pit is bigger than an egg. It seems unreasonable. That's the Gemara's challenging, unless the pit is that big. Presumably. Right, so when they brought Rabbi Gamliel 2 dates to eat, was without the pit. So he can eat them nicely, right? They took the pit out. Right, he still would have, that's true. Even if they brought him the pit, he still wouldn't have eaten the pit. So he's only eating the flesh, the fruit of it, right? No, the pit wouldn't count for that which he is required to eat in the sukkah. He's required to eat in the sukkah that which he is eating. He's not eating the pit, so the pit doesn't count. So as part of the measure, even if the pit was there, good point. Following? Right. We're just using the pit as a measure. But in the case of Rabbi Gamliel, he's using the date as to what he's actually eating. And now he's obviously not eating the actual pit. He's only eating 2 dates. Now, the bottom line is that we have to assume the pit is that big that it at least doubles the date in size. takes the date from less than a half of a kibetza, because 2 dates are less than a kibetza, and turns it into bigger than a kibetza, because that's what Rabbi said, that the big date with the pit is bigger than a kibetza, is bigger than an egg. Follow? And if the Gemara says, Rabbi says, yes indeed. Shtei kaisevas, 2 dates, the loy gadinasan, without their pits, loy have a kibetza, is not the size of a kibetza. And kaisevas agasa, but 1 big date, vigarinasa, and its pit, havayaseda mikabetza, is indeed bigger than an egg. In other words, the pit is that big. I mean, we do see that date pits are big, but meaning they're not the size of like tiny seeds that you would see in an apple. They're quite big. So big date might have a big enough pit to make it bigger than an egg. That's what Rabbi is arguing. So yes, indeed. So first of all, the dates they brought to Rabbi Gamliel could have been ordinary sized dates. So 2 ordinary sized dates out their pits are less than a size of an egg. 1 large date with its large pit would be a little bit bigger than a kibetza, considering the fact that the dates themselves are to begin with very big. Almost the size, they're almost in volume as big as the entire flesh of the fruit, essentially. Sorry? Why? That's the point. That's Rabbi Gimpl's point. When we measure the date with the pit for Yom Kippur, we're not talking about you eating an actual date. We're talking about you eating bread that's the size of the volume of the date with the pit. So in other words, the date and the pit for Yom Kippur is just the size of a measure. But when we talked about Rabbi Gamliel, it was an actual story where he was actually served dates. He obviously didn't eat the pits. So the only measure we're going to measure is the flesh of the 2 fruits. That's why it's not cheating. It's just they're 2 different contexts, right? One is what he's actually eating, and one is using it for a measure. Okay. Yeah, the same discussion. Does the olive include the pit as well? Okay. So now the Gemara says like this. Amar Papa says, Hanyu the Amri Inchi. This is what the colloquial is saying is, Trei kabi de tamri. If you bought 2 kav is a measure. So you bought 2 measures of, kav is it's a measure of volume. Sorry? No, liquid measure is usually a hin, right? So a kav is a measure. So you bought 2 measures, 2 kav of date. So the colloquial saying is, chad kav de kashi v'sarech. You'll have 1 and a bit of that measure, more than half of what you bought is going to be in pits. So it's the colloquial saying to kind of describe know the value of what you're about to buy. And when you buy 2 kav of date, more than half of it's going to be in pits, in seed. Okay. So this is one way of looking at it, in that theoretically, that's correct. The colloquial saying gives you the relationship between the size of the pit versus the size of the flesh, in that the pit is bigger than the flesh itself. Right? I mean, today, most dates that I've seen, the pits are big, but they're not bigger than the entire flesh. So maybe it's possible that these large dates are of a different nature, and it's also possible that over the millennia, the nature of dates have changed. I mean, we've genetically modified fruits to make them more appealing to us. So the fruits that we eat are not exactly the fruits that they used to eat 1,000 years ago. So it's possible that these things. Sorry. Anyway, not fruits. These are part of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Rava says. So this is another way of understanding why Rabbi Gamliel was not obligated to eat these dates in the Sukkah. Right? We said that he ate in the Sukkah because he wanted to be stringent upon himself. He wanted to be extra machmer. He wanted to show his love for the mitzvah of the Sukkah. But that assumes that if the dates were such that they were the size of an egg, he would actually be required to eat in the Sukkah. Rabbi says, no, that's not the assumption. Hasam hainu taima. Here's the reason why Rabbi Gamliel was not obligated to eat in the Sukkah. Not because these 2 dates were less than the measure of an egg, but mishum peda, because they were fruit. And even if he had a whole bowl of fruit, he wouldn't be obligated. Fruit does not need to be eaten in the Sukkah. So you cannot deduce from the story of Rabbi Gamliel anything with regard to the size of the date. That's irrelevant. It's very possible that the dates were way bigger than the size of an egg, and he still didn't have to eat them in the sukkah because it's a fruit and does not require to eat in the sukkah. Eating in the sukkah, one is only required when it's a permanent meal, namely a meal of bread. Or mezainis, that is a permanent meal. We're going to see a little bit about that, but we're not learning the laws of sukkah, so we're not going to digress there. But the rule is definitely that fruit, one is not required to eat in the sukkah. And this is indeed the halacha. Okay. Now the Gemara challenges this notion that fruit never required to be eaten in the sukkah. May say, I'll raise the following challenge. And again, may say is a challenge raised by a source greater than the one speaking. So the one speaking here is Rava, who asserted that fruit do not need to be eaten in the sukkah, and that's why Rabbi Gamliel did not have to eat those dates in the sukkah, even irrespective of the size of those dates. Now we're about to quote the Mishnah H text, which reads, Amar Rabbi, Rabbi says, when we had the privilege to study Torah at the heels of Rabbi Lezer, son of Shamua, they brought before him on Sukkot, they brought him a bowl of fruit, dates, ma'anavim, and grapes. And we ate them, achilas aray, in a temporary measure, chutz l'sukkah, outside of the sukkah. End quote. Now the Gemara analyzes what this tells you is achilas aray. The reason why they were able to eat these fruit out of the sukkah is because they made it a temporary snack. And that's why they were allowed to eat it out of the sukkah. Achilas kava, had they decided to sit down and have a meal of fruit, they wouldn't be able to eat it out of the sukkah. So the assumption here is, from the story, that fruit do require to be eaten in the sukkah. It just depends on whether you eat them as a temporary snack or as a meal. If you turn it into a meal, you would require to eat it. If that's the case, then perhaps Rabbi Gamliel, who is now having a meal with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is actually required to go to the sukkah. And why would we say he's not required to go to the sukkah? Therefore, must be the only reason why he's not required to go to the sukkah is because it's less than an egg. So Rabbi, yes, exactly. So Rabbi's assertion that the reason why he didn't have to go to the sukkah is because it was a fruit is now being thrown in question. Because here we see Rabbi saying that when he was by Rabbi Lezer ben Shamua, he would have been required to eat in the sukkah had he ate those fruits in a permanent fashion, as a proper meal. Says the Gemara, loy. You're reading it the wrong way. Sorry, loy. Don't think that it was because they chose to eat it as a temporary snack is why they were exempt from going to the sukkah. But had it been permanent, they would have to go to the sukkah. Incorrect. We ate them because it is a temporary eating. In other words, what Rabbi is saying is not that we subjectively ate the fruits as a temporary snack, and that's why we didn't have to eat in the sukkah. Fruits are essentially a temporary snack. And therefore, no matter how much you eat of them, you never have to go to the sukkah. Because they are, in essence, a temporary snack thing. That's one way of understanding it. And that this would substantiate Rabbi's view that any fruit is not required to be eaten in the sukkah. Another way of understanding this story of Rabbi Huda, with studying by Rabbi Lezer ben Shamua, achlunuam, we ate them, achilas kava, we ate the fruits as a permanent thing, and fruits, even if you eat them as a permanent meal, are not required to be taken to the sukkah, but we ate along with it some bread that was in a temporary fashion. And that is the big deal. Because you might have thought, hey, you're eating bread and those fruits are a permanent meal, then go take it to the sukkah. So it says Rabbi Lezer ben Shamua taught us the fruits don't have to go to the sukkah, even though we're eating it as a permanent meal. And even the bread you're eating now, because you're only eating it as a temporary snack, you also don't have to go to the sukkah. And there's the big teaching from Lezer ben Shamua. But nonetheless, what remains is, if you're eating fruit, you don't have to go to the sukkah. And thus, that is why Rabbi Gamliel didn't have to go to the sukkah, and has nothing to do with the size of the dates. Okay. We'll do one more statement from the Gemara. And then tomorrow we'll look at the halachic description of what the size of the large date is, which is actually a little less than a kibetza rather than a little bigger than the kibetza. Because till now we were discussing, arguing for and against the presumption that the large date described in our Mishnah as the minimum requirement for culpability on Yom Kippur is a little bigger than a kibetza. And tomorrow we're going to flip it and go to the other side, the other opinion, which is the halachic opinion, that the size of the large date is a little less than the size of a kibetza, a little less than the size of an egg. So let's see the last statement on this opinion. Okay, the statement Rabbi said in describing what happened with Rabbi Lezer and Shamua was that we didn't need to eat these fruits in the Sukkah because they were temporary, right? So how do we reconcile that with Rava's view that fruits don't have to be eaten in the Sukkah ever, even if you ate it permanently? Answer, there were two things going on here. They had fruit and bread. The fruit may have been a permanent meal. Doesn't matter. It's fruit or don't have to go to the Sukkah, even if it's a permanent meal, right? But the reason why I'm telling you that there's a big deal and that we didn't have to go to the Sukkah because it was only temporary is because we actually ate bread. And when we ate bread, we ate it as a snack. And that's why we didn't have to go to the Sukkah, because it was a snack, even though it was bread. So really what Rabbi is telling us in terms of relating to us the anecdote of Lezer ben Shammua was to teach us two things. Number one, that fruit don't have to go to the Sukkah, even if it's a permanent meal. And number two, because bread was only temporary, therefore we didn't have to go to the Sukkah either. So we're adding a detail to the anecdote, basically. Sorry? That's a good question, and I thought about that. Maybe it's very possible they had let's say they washed and they had bread just to sweep up the vegetable juice. You know, like you take bread and you dip it into sauce. Yeah, you take bread and you dip it into olive oil to eat. If you made it into a permanent meal, right? But sorry. Right, but over here it seems it doesn't say anything about the size. It's possible they ate more than a kibetza of bread, which means maybe they didn't have to wash, possibly, but they didn't have to. But they would have said they would have achlu pachis mikazayis. Here he says achlu pachis mikashir. Doesn't say achlu pachis mikashir. Okay, so it's possible they ate less than the amount. It's possible, or it's also possible that they ate more than the amount, but because it was only a temporary snack just to sweep up to wash down the fruit, if you will, or to absorb the juice of the fruit, so they didn't have to go to the Sukkah. These are just assumptions, but I don't know for sure. Sorry? But Sukkah was the same thing, but there the Gemara states explicitly it was less than the size of a thing. Maybe. Right, maybe. Okay, was that clear? So what the Gemara is doing is the Gemara is adding a detail to the anecdote so that on the one hand, it allows us to keep our understanding that fruit don't have to be taken to the Sukkah. And at the same time, it gives us a reason for why Rabbi Yehuda mentioned the notion of temporariness as part of the exemption for not going to the Sukkah. Right? Why did he mention temporary as a reason for not going to the Sukkah? If the reason for not going to the Sukkah is because it's fruit, then say we ate fruit, and that's we didn't go to the Sukkah, period. Why mention that it was temporary? By adding the detail that they ate bread, now we know why Rabbi Yehuda had to mention that it was temporary. Because the only reason why they had to take the bread to the Sukkah was because it was temporary. Not because of the fruit, it's correct. Even if fruit isn't temporary, it doesn't matter, fruit doesn't have to go to the Sukkah. Right? But we're adding the detail of the bread to explain why Rabbi had to mention the detail of temporariness as an exemption for going to the Sukkah. Because he ate bread temporarily. Yeah, so it is very much not advised to eat any bread out of the Sukkah. Even someone who does not eat every snack in the Sukkah. In Chabad, we eat everything in the Sukkah, including a glass of water. But even someone who doesn't do that and only eats their permanent meals in the Sukkah, not advised to wash and say, I'm snacking on bread and eat it out of the Sukkah. Not an advised behavior. So if you have a salad with a few croutons, it's a good example of temporary bread. Okay, I hear that. Even if, at least depending on what kind of croutons they are, you might even have to wash and bench for this croutons. It depends what kind of croutons, how they were made, what was the intention of making them, what's the ingredients, whether they're covered in spices or not. Lots of details into. Right. Let's assume that the croutons were made of toasted bread, which are actually required to wash and bench. That would be, I guess, a temporary kind of snacking on bread because you're eating them part of your salad. That's a good example. Very good example. Okay, let's do this next few lines. Gemara asks, before we get to tomorrow, which is the halachic analysis itself. The Gemara suggests, Lema, let us suggest, Misayele, that the following statement supports Rava's view. Rava stated earlier that fruits do not have to be eaten in the Sukkah. So let us suggest that the following text, the following Mishnah H text, is a support for that view. What does that Mishnah H text say? It speaks of the obligation that one is required to eat, according to one opinion, 14 meals in the Sukkah over the span of Sukkahs, 2 every day. 7 days of Sukkahs, 2 every day. You're required to at least have total of 14 meals in the Sukkah. Right? What this really means is that even if it's raining, you'd have to go there. Halacha is that the first night of Sukkah, you for sure have to have a meal in the Sukkah. Even if it's raining, even non-Chabadniks will go into the Sukkah for the first night, make Kiddush, and eat something. Even if they get the rest of the meal out of the Sukkah, because you have to have at least some meal in the Sukkah, at least the first night of Sukkah. Now there's another view which says that you have to have 14 meals in the Sukkah. So even if it's raining, you would still have to have at least twice a day a meal in the Sukkah to fulfill your obligation of living in the Sukkah. Now, according to this view, says the Mishnah H text, therefore, if he completed meal number 13 and meal number 14, not with actual bread, but with some sort of sweet, some sort of dessert, a cake, something like that, then Yatza, he fulfilled the obligation of having 14 meals. So which means this targima, this sweet dish, this dessert, is definitely considered a meal in which you are required to eat in the Sukkah. Because it can be used to fulfill your obligation to have 14 meals. Now says the Gemara, if you were to suggest that fruit by Sukkah needs to be eaten in the Sukkah, then why say you need to have some sweet to cover your 14 meals? Lisli pedis. The text should have said, eat fruit. Therefore it must be that fruit not need to be eaten in the Sukkah. And thus this supports the view of Rava. Because if fruit were required to be eaten in the Sukkah, then that would be on the list of items to fulfill your 14 meals. Right? The fact that it's not, and the Mishnah chose to tell you to take sweets, which is like a more expensive dish than fruit. Right? Notice if you're trying to lower the bar, then go to the lowest bar, say eat fruit. The fact that it didn't say that means fruit not have to be eaten in the Sukkah, thus it supports the view of Rav. Says the Gemara, first of all, my mini targima, what do you think these sweets are? I suggest that sweets are cakes. But the Gemara is saying, why are you assuming that? Targima just means sweets. And you might as well say that targima is pedis, that the sweets are fruits. Candy fruits, something like that. Well, not candy would be shahako, but fruit. Candy fruit, yeah, like fruit fruit themselves are sweet. Yeah, well, fruit themselves a lot of them are very sweet anyway. So first of all, don't assume that these sweets have some sort of cake or baked element. They're sweets, that includes fruits. So therefore, this is not a conclusive support of Rava. Not that it's a contradiction, that's not conclusive. My other way of reading it is, the reason why it said to take sweets, rather than saying take fruit, is because this text happened to be written in a location where fruits are not available. So it used something that was more common, which is the local sweets. But don't derive from here that fruit do not have to be eaten in the Sukkah. Not that it's a contradiction, because it doesn't say fruit does not have to be eaten in the Sukkah. It doesn't say a negative term, anything about fruit, but you cannot conclusively prove from here that fruit don't need to be eaten in the Sukkah. Notwithstanding the fact that this is not a conclusive proof, the halacha still remains, fruit do not need to be eaten in the Sukkah. Tomorrow, God willing, we get back to the halacha of eating on Yom Kippur. And till now, we've gone under the assumption of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that the minimum size for culpability is a little bit bigger than an egg, this large date. Tomorrow, we're going to learn Rabbi Zvid, who tells us that the Kesevas Agasa, the large date, is a little bit smaller than the egg, and that indeed remains the halacha. And we'll look more at that, God willing, tomorrow in analysis in a similar fashion that we did today. A wonderful day, everybody.